All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 30th, 1948, in the Democratic primary for Senate in Texas, Coke Stevenson leads Lyndon Johnson by a count of 492,481 to 492,271. Stevenson is up by about 200 votes or so. It is a real nail-biter. And Stevenson would go on to maintain that lead, win the nomination, become a two-time senator, then a vice president, then one of the most influential presidents in American history. Not to mention, Stevenson is the subject of a 5-part biography by the legendary writer Robert Caro. I'm sorry. None of that happened to Coke Stevenson. All of that did happen to LBJ. And that may be because in the weeks after the vote tally in the 1948 Senate Texas primary, where LBJ was initially down to Stevenson, a batch of ballots appeared of mysterious origin, all weighted very heavily towards LBJ, all with the same handwriting on them. We'll get into that. But that mysterious batch of ballots came to be known as Box 13. It appeared and it swung the primary to Johnson, who did end up winning and becoming a senator and president and all those things that I mentioned before. So a shout out before we get going to listener Michael and a few others I think who have suggested this as a topic, and also the 1948 election, which is just really interesting in its own right. We will get into it. Box 13, the very shady 1948 Texas Senate primary. Our special guest for this episode is Mark Lawrence, professor of history at UT Austin and director of the LBJ Library at UT. Mark, thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me.
Have you ever mused about whether it would be do you know what Coke Stevenson's middle name was?
I do not.
Robert. Did you ever think, maybe I would be the director of the CRS library?
D.R. Stevenson. Never, not once, but you've already brought something new to my day.
And here, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So Mark, there's this mysterious box, these ballots, the fact that it does seem to swing this election. But first, tell us, all this goes down in what is Jim Wells County, a town of Alice. I love these names. But tell us about this part of Texas.
So Jim Wells County is one of the counties that make up what Texans refer to as the Valley, the Rio Grande Valley, which is to say a strip of territory along the Mexican border. Then as now, in 1948, as now populated heavily by Mexican and Mexican-American folks.
And it's pretty rural, the kind of place where something shady might get engineered.
Correct. Very, very much rural. These metropolises like Alice and San Diego were, of course, very small, dusty towns.
So let's talk about the 1948 election. 1941, Johnson had run for this same seat and lost, and actually maybe thought that he had gotten a little robbed there by a man named Pappy O'Daniel, who he thought maybe pulled some shady stuff to make him lose in 1941. So he's coming in at least into 1948 feeling a little aggrieved and despondent, right?
That's right. And I think you're absolutely right to start there. I think to understand what happens in 1948, it's really important to think about 1941 when LBJ seemed to have a Senate seat within his grasp. And then at the last minute, votes were discovered, and Papio Daniel went to the Senate instead of Lyndon Johnson. And LBJ seems to have learned some lessons about how he would behave next time around, assuming there would be a next time, to make sure that he came out on top.
Oh, he's like, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. Is that what he thought?
I think that's right. I mean, to be a successful politician in Texas, as in so much of the United States in that era, was to be a practitioner of political practices that would strike us in the 21st century as deeply suspect and transparently unethical. But at that time, these were methods that were practiced really across the political spectrum, and those who came out on top were oftentimes the ones who were most skilled in pulling the levers and pulling the strings of machine politics.
This is so interesting because I think that we have in our mind, in our imagination of machine politics, Boss Tweed in the late 19th century in New York, and then the reformers and the Goo-Goos, the good government people come in and they clean it all up. But machine politics remain so important for much of the 20th century in places like Cook County in Illinois, but also in places like Missouri. Harry Truman comes out of the Pendergast machine in Missouri. And machine politics are not the cleanest political game in town.
So I want to get into the TikTok of Box 13 and these votes and where they show up and why they are so suspect. But, one more thing about the 1948 election, and to your point about having learned lessons, I think not just the lesson of dirty tricks can help, but we actually have had this election and this Senate primary suggested to us a number of times, and a couple people have suggested it to us, and I actually had it written down on some list somewhere as the helicopter election before it was even the Box 13 election. And this was an election in which LBJ used a helicopter to get around to the more rural parts of Texas, and helicopters fairly new technology, and I think he was the first kind of politician to really use it. And so I'm just wondering, kind of, there was some innovation in a real sense with that as well. So like this election did feel like it was pushing the boundaries and LBJ and showing LBJ as a very skilled politician.
I think that's right. I mean, LBJ was certainly a long shot for the 1948 Senate seat. Coke Stevenson was enormously popular, well established in Texas. Of course, LBJ was as well, but Coke Stevenson was really, it seems to me, on a different level. He was an iconic figure almost in the state of Texas. But LBJ proved to be a master of radio, for one thing, and also used the helicopter, as you say, very effectively, so that he could travel quickly all over the place and descend almost without warning into small Texas towns. And his hard work to win over rural voters had always been something that LBJ was particularly good at. But here in 1948, we see him using technology in ways that were a little bit ahead of his time to increase his visibility. And this seems to have had some significant effect in closing that gap with Coke Stevenson and bringing him within reach.
He would, the helicopter would show up in town and I mean, not surprisingly, be an attraction and people would come gather around, or he would hover over a farm and he had a giant loudspeaker attached to it, and it would blare out a message, and he would say, "Hello down there, this is your friend Lyndon Johnson, a candidate.
Brilliant.
I hope you'll vote for me on primary day."
It's so great.
And then he also would sort of say, there's reports he said, if you ever find a box of ballots in the middle of a field somewhere, that's real. Who knows if that'll happen? But,
just in case,
throwing that out there, just in case.
That's right. I mean, lots of people had never seen a helicopter before, so this was a curiosity, right? And presumably there was some political benefit to being seen as the candidate who was kind of in touch with new developments, new technology. But these were, according to all the records we, still have, great spectacles of this what are they called? The Johnson City windmill was the description that was attached to LBJ's helicopter, and he would descend kind of out of nowhere in town centers or on the outskirts and throw his hat. Right, that was part of the ritual as well. And then someone would have to go into the crowd and recover the hat because hats were expensive.
There wasn't a stack of hats.
Hats are still expensive.
It wasn't like a T-shirt cannon.
Yeah, I know.
All right. End of August. As I said, we have this vote. The ballots across the state of Texas are counted, 492,481 to 492,271. Stevenson is up by just over a couple hundred votes. Talk us through the sort of shady stuff that happens to, quote unquote, find these extra votes that tip Johnson. But why is it, coming back to Jim Wells County, why is it there, of all the counties in Texas, that this dirty trick takes place?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that dirty tricks were probably playing out across the state. And there was good reason to think that, machine politics were in play, not just for LBJ, but also in places for Coke Stevenson. So, what happens in Jim Wells County and Alice, is certainly easily the most famous episode from that 1948 Senate race. But, as historians of this episode have pointed out again and again, these kinds of practices were fairly widespread. But Jim Wells County became the focal point of action in those decisive days, in part largely because of the role of a guy named George B. Parr. And George Parr was a political boss in Duval County. He was called the Duke of Duval, and to a little bit lesser extent, but still very significantly, in Jim Wells County. He was someone who had been a master of machine politics, like his father, for many years. And he was seen, it seems to me, by people close to Lyndon Johnson as a reliable source for the additional ballots that would be necessary in order to put LBJ over the top. He was understood to be someone who was very skilled at playing the games of machine politics and could deliver the number of ballots that would be needed in order to assure the outcome that LBJ was looking for.
I just think it's so wild that when they found these extra ballots, that they're all written in the same handwriting. They're alphabetical.
Don't people vote alphabetically? Is that how you do it?
Yeah.
Like Abbott, Barnes, Carter. And it just is. But I will say this, like, as someone who studies the 19th century, I think about Kansas and how, like, they would have an election. There would be 1,000 people in the town and, like, 3,000 ballots cast. And you're like, okay, this is egregious. Yeah. But for 202, very specific number, and 2 votes going for the opponent, just to make it look like, there were some people that may have voted for the opponent. But I don't know, to me it's a little comical.
Yeah, exactly. And we know a lot of the details of this story thanks to interviews that were given by a man named Luis Salas, who is a fascinating figure. So we know George Parr. And, he was understood at the time to be a very important player in South Texas. George Parr, like presumably all political bosses, had a number of people who worked for him who, made things happen down at the grassroots level. And a guy named Luis Salas, who'd been born in Mexico, came to the United States earlier in his life and became an important lieutenant to George Parr. And Luis Salas, over the years following 1948, gradually opened up about his role. And he was present at the moment when those additional names were added. He was well aware of what was going on. So we know a lot of the details thanks to this really fascinating individual. And I think, honestly, that's one reason why the Box 13 episode is so well known and fascinates people so much, because there's this really intriguing figure who brought all this to life. But you're quite right that he was there when the names were added. And according to his own account, he said effectively, do you think maybe we should mix things up and not just do it alphabetically? And, the other people in the room said, no, don't worry about it. So, there was clearly some awareness that, that they should make this look good for the historical record. But, it tells you something about the nature of machine politics and how entrenched these kinds of practices were, that at the end of the day, no one really particularly cared about those niceties. And something as kind of blatantly, corrupt as listing names in alphabetical order was past muster in that moment.
It's interesting. I know that we're very concerned, for good reason, with the contemporary state of democracy. But the story, along with what Kellie was saying earlier about 3,000 ballots in a town of 1,000, or even just the fact that we don't get a secret ballot in the United States until the late 19th, early 20th century, that having free and fair elections as a goal is a great thing. It's something that the U.S. has worked toward very, very, very slowly. And the expectation that you would have a free and fair election without this kind of chicanery is a pretty new development in the United States.
Agreed. That's exactly right. And one of the most remarkable points to make, I think, about Lyndon Johnson's involvement in this long story of voting reform and cleaning up many of these corrupt practices is that Lyndon Johnson himself was, at a certain point in his career, a beneficiary of and a skilled practitioner of these tactics, but in the 1960s would become the figurehead of voting rights and fundamental reform of voting practices. So, if we're inclined to be a little critical of LBJ and some of his maneuvering back in 1948, I think we have to give him his due by recognizing that a few decades later, he was the man of voting rights, and he, I think quite sincerely considered the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to be his single proudest accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's in large part how Caro positions LBJ as like someone who had to ruthlessly play the game in order to accomplish higher goals. And there's all sorts of fraught questions about, where those lines get blurred and so forth. But on LBJ and this incident and kind of his involvement here, I mean, all of you have pointed out kind of this mix of both ruthlessness and, concerted chicanery, but then also sort of sloppy work. And it's just sort of interesting because clearly, like, I think, some of the details here indicate that there was an understanding even ahead of time that, like, we might have to pull some levers. LBJ was very concerned with getting real-time updates of the vote total as much as possible, and that sort of seems to indicate that maybe then word would get out about, well, if we're down by X amount, and so if we're down by 200, go ahead and find 200 ballots in a box somewhere. But then again, not being concerned with the alphabetization in the box 13 or whatever. It's just this interesting mix. But but like, what do we know or what do we not know about LBJ's direct involvement in this particular ballot scheme?
This is one of the most mysterious and controversial dimensions of the whole story. Wow. To what degree was LBJ personally involved? Luis Salas, this fascinating figure I mentioned earlier, stated repeatedly in interview after interview after interview that Lyndon Johnson himself came to Alice 3 days after the voting to participate in the conversations about what needed to be done. Salas doesn't suggest that LBJ was particularly assertive or directed the process, but he made the trip, according to Salas. Now, Lyndon Johnson friends and loyalists have insisted over the years that this did not happen. Okay, LBJ may have been a skilled practitioner of machine politics. He was not pure as the driven snow on this whole episode, but he was not literally in Alice. And the debate continues, I think, to this day. Salas repeatedly, though, says he was there, and he's in an oral history that was just released, actually, by the LBJ Library. You see the questioner saying, "Are you sure it was Lyndon Johnson? Are you sure it couldn't have been someone else?" And he repeatedly says, no, it was Lyndon Johnson standing in that room.
Wow.
Robert Caro writes later that a Johnson aide told him that Johnson had kind of purposely avoided asking directly for the fraud to be committed so that he would then, if needed, be able to testify that he, under oath, that he did not have any involvement here, which we know is a very tried and true tactic. You kind of create the conditions in which everyone clearly knows what you want to happen, but you don't have to actually explicitly say it, and then that gives you an out. So there may have been a little of that going on too.
Exactly. I think deniability was an important consideration. And I think even if LBJ did go to Alice, he was still, according to Salas, standoffish right in those conversations, and presumably made an impression by his presence, but didn't have to say much. If in fact he did go.
There's so many ifs.
I know. So many little caveats just to maintain the. Because we don't know.
To me, not that we're supposed to delve into counterfactuals or anything like that, but to me, what is so fascinating is that, what if he lost? Like what? When I think about, I got a chance to go to the LBJ Library maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It was an awesome experience. I highly recommend anybody go visit all the presidential libraries. They're great, but like this one in Austin was just really remarkable to see all of the legislation that LBJ put forth. It was incredible. And to think about that not being there, something like Head Start or the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, like all of that legislation, I can't imagine like where we would go from there, like who would implement, or what would our expectations be from the government after that, or it's just it's sort of wild to think about because he gave so much legislation.
Absolutely. It's an interesting mental exercise to sort of rerun American history from the 1950s forward without Lyndon Johnson. I think we can go too far in kind of embracing a great man theory that suggests that only this person, could have done these things. I think as you all know, as well as I do, American politics were changing in ways that were changing the politics surrounding civil rights. We're changing the politics surrounding big liberal ambitions. We're changing the calculations around the role that government should play in ordinary people's lives. So Lyndon Johnson was hardly the only person who would have pushed the kinds of policies that came to represent the Great Society. But it is important to recognize that he had certain skills, persuasive skills. He knew how to work Congress from having served in Congress himself for such a long period of time. And he made things happen maybe more quickly, more efficiently, more dramatically than would have been possible in the hands of a President Kefauver or a President Symington or whoever the alternatives might have been.
Yeah. And, to add a dimension there, we mentioned this earlier, but it does seem, Mark, that Johnson was going into this election pretty, burnt out and maybe cynical about politics. And that if he had lost, maybe, I don't know if that would have been the end of his political career, but maybe it's not like, Biden loses in 1980 or whatever and keeps trying. Yep. Maybe this would have been the end of his political career. The pressure
was really on LBJ in 1948 because he had to give up his House seat. He couldn't run for both, right? So he had no safety net in the political world. By this time, he was a relatively successful businessman, along with his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. So, the way Caro tells his story, and I think this is probably right, he envisioned a very different path for himself as a business person, largely developing his media empire if he had lost that race. But it probably would have meant the end of his political career.
Well, I'm also curious about the box itself, since it is the title of both this episode, but also the mystery itself, that it comes to stand in for all of this scandal. What ever happened to Box 13?
Well, it's one of the big mysteries of this whole story. It disappears. And no one knows what came of it. There were, of course, investigations that were launched in those early days after the voting. Coke Stevenson and his lawyers were immediately on the case and pressing for legal intervention to reverse the result. And getting inside that box, of course, was crucial to that investigation. But really, there was never a moment when the box was opened and those ballots were analyzed. So we know what was in that box largely because of Luis Salas's description of how the process went down. But at the end of the day, there were only 4 or 5 people in the room when that happened.
Is it metal? Is it wood? What kind of box are we talking about here?
You got to be in the room where it happened.
That's right.
Great question.
Well, in part because I think one person claimed that the box got taken out into the desert and burned. The ballots were taken, but the box was burned. You'll never find the box again. I mean, there's all these rumors around it. Another tidbit just to throw in there that's very interesting is that this is not necessarily a conspiracy. This is after they found the 200 votes,
Yep.
conveniently, that when they went to change the ledger and the vote total, it was quite convenient that all they had to do was change a 7 to a 9.
Right.
So they just like added that little downward part to change the 7 into a
Exactly.
9. How convenient. Unless someone wants to attribute that to LBJ. What a mastermind. He knew there'd be a 7 and all you had to do was
Yep.
Tiny little pen stroke that changed the course of history.
Right?
One larger question, and I think has obvious parallels to now, but one of the parts of this whole episode that really strikes me and feels so resonant to me is that there is, this mysterious box of ballots that gets found, and you have a local official who's in cahoots and willing to do what it takes. Mm-hmm. But then a couple days after these votes emerge, it is not until a certifying committee in the Democratic Party puts their stamp on this vote total that this becomes official.
Right.
And that to me feels so resonant and so important to point out that there are these systems in place, and that the power lies in these pockets that we don't necessarily look at, and we don't, we think of like the ballot box and then the person who wins.
Right.
And instead there's all these certifying things, and we're far too familiar with all those steps, in this day and age. But, that was the sort of linchpin moment here, and obviously now that is the target of a lot of this chicanery. These local officials, these steps along the way, and if you can manipulate those, you really got your hands on the levers of power.
Absolutely. Of course, one of the things that LBJ had going for him is that he was supported by the sitting president, Harry Truman. He had been very close, of course, to Franklin Roosevelt. So LBJ had these connections to the Democratic Party establishment. He was their guy. Cook Stevenson was not as deeply connected to the National Democratic Party. And it's pretty clear, I think, in retrospect, that this really worked against Cook Stevenson and powerfully in LBJ's favor. The Texas Democratic Party at that time was split between the forces that remained, true to Truman and FDR and all that they represented. Very much this was Lyndon Johnson's world, and a much more conservative brand of democratic politics that Coke Stevenson represented. Now, over the long term, perhaps Coke Stevenson's vision of democratic politics came to prevail in Texas. But in 1948, LBJ was aligned with the faction that had the national connections, that had the clout. And this was crucial, I think, to that certifying process that ultimately, as you say, was crucial to the outcome.
As we wrap up, what parts of this remain a mystery? We pointed out, the box itself. I actually should add, I think there was some reporting in 2017 that there are still locals in Alice who say that someone in town has the box. And so it's a cold case.
I've got it.
This is a true crime podcast.
I was about to say.
But what questions are you curious about? What do you think there's more investigation to be done? And then when we were emailing about this, did you mention that there were some new sort of documents or something related to this that came into the LBJ library?
Your timing is really incredible, because literally in an hour, a gentleman named Peter Mangan is delivering to the LBJ library 9 cassette tapes that capture interviews that this man, Peter Mangan's father, made in interviews with Luis Salas.
What?
Peter, the father was an AP reporter who in 1977 basically broke the story. If you go back to the stories in 1977, you can see the bombshell that broke this story. So these are the cassette tapes that capture the interviews that were done in 1977 and resulted in the stories that broke the scoop. What happens in the 1970s is that George Parr died, I believe in 1975 or so, and Luis Salas, who had lied under oath in an earlier point, came clean. And he started to give interviews. Robert Caro was able to track him down. He actually wrote a memoir called Box 13, which I've never seen. Apparently, Robert Caro has a copy of it. He obtained this by simply tracking Luis Salas down in a suburb of Houston in the 1980s. But at any rate, yes, we are receiving today those cassettes. No one here has listened to them yet. The gentleman who's donated them has listened to them.
Mark, do you love your job? Do you love your job?
It's pretty cool.
All right. So, Mark, I mean, if there is bombshell information in there,
you know where to break that news.
Yeah. Can we extract a pledge that you will come back on this show and advance the story?
I will let you know.
Okay, I appreciate that. Wow, that is really fascinating, and I mean, it's still lots of mystery. Try and find out if that box, because I'm reading tin, I'm reading wood. I'm not sure exactly what it is. So at least
I'll see what I can learn.
Okay. Okay. Well,
when you first contacted me, I thought it was in connection with that donation, because the two things were just so in sync.
Well, there you go. All right. Well, Mark Lawrence of UT Austin and director of the LBJ Library, this has been really fascinating. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.